The question is that this House has considered consular support for British citizens. I call the Minister, Rory Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. McCabe. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Consular support is fundamental to British foreign policy. It's probably the very oldest element of British foreign policy, Mr. McCabe. Before we had a Foreign Office, protecting British citizens abroad was in our DNA. And it remains for us a very fundamental responsibility. That's why we have hundreds of consular staff working across the world in very difficult circumstances. That obligation is going into a new world, a world that is changing. When our consul in Aleppo set up in 1570, he saw 12 British citizens in a year. Today, there are 70 million trips made by British citizens in a single year. Nearly 43 million British citizens currently possess passports. This is one of the most travelled countries on earth, and we wish it to remain so. It's an adventurous trading nation. It's a nation where a lot of our citizens are dual nationals, and many of our citizens are living in other people's countries. There are 100,000 British nationals living in South Africa alone. There are over 600,000 British nationals living in the United States. And it's not simply that we have more people travelling than ever before, it's that the world is changing. The world is becoming more dangerous. There are people in this room who will have had contemporaries who would have been able to take a bus from Victoria Station to Delhi in the 1970s. They would have been able to drive across Syria, Iraq, Iran. They would have gone right across Afghanistan, from Herat to Kabul. They would have been able to travel through the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. None of that is possible today for a British citizen. In fact, there are nearly 50 countries in the world which are in a fragile or conflict-affected state. It's never been so dangerous. And at the same time, our relationship with other people's countries is changing. In the 1850s, Lord Palmerston stood up in this House and established the principle that any British citizen who got in trouble would involve the deployment of a British gunboat. When a British dual national in Athens, the late 1830s, wasn't paid for some damage to his property, an entire squadron of the Royal Navy deployed to Athens to try to deal with this. Today we live in a situation that even the United States of America, a country that is able to deploy 105,000 troops on the ground, that's able to spend over $100 billion a year, frequently struggles to get even quite small countries to provide the respect to their citizens that they wish. This problem isn't just a problem for the United States or for Britain or for Europe. It is a problem for every country in the world. And the challenge for our consular staff is that in dealing with the 70 million odd trips that British citizens make around the world every year, there is a huge variety of problems they have to deal with. I've been myself, for example, to see the consular activities run out of Marbella, where we're having to deal with hundreds of British citizens who end up in Spanish jails frequently because they've had too good a night out. But consular assistance needs to extend from that to British citizens who are captured by Islamist terrorist groups and find themselves in a boiler suit in the desert, about to have their heads chopped off in some of the most difficult and inaccessible countries on earth. And in between, they have to deal with the fallout of Hurricane Irma, with earthquakes, with military coups, and the cases that have been brought by the Honourable and Right Honourable members show exactly how difficult it is. These are cases which the members of Parliament have advocated for very, very powerfully. They're difficult cases. They show exactly where Britain is having to respond. Let me take them in turn. The first case which was raised is a case of a British national who, as we've heard, travelled to southern Iraq. Southern Iraq, I served in southern Iraq. It's not a safe place. We advise against travelling there on our websites. British embassy staff basically cannot travel to those areas of southern Iraq. It's too dangerous. He went there with an American construction company. We absolutely support that commercial drive, that adventurous spirit that leads a British citizen from your constituency, from the Honourable Member's constituency, to wish to travel to southern Iraq. He found himself in a situation in which his company had not paid the hotel, and the hotel had taken his passport. The Honourable Member then championed his case very powerfully with our department. But our consular staff acted. They acted by calling the hotel repeatedly to push for the passport to be returned. They acted by calling the US embassy repeatedly. And they acted also by trying to provide support for him to access legal advice. Now, we feel absolutely the frustration that your constituent feels. I too, having been in southern Iraq, would feel if I was stuck in a hotel in southern Basra in a difficult situation with my passport held, extremely frustrated, angry with the company, angry with the hotel, angry with my government. We are very fortunate that it was resolved. I'd like to pay tribute to the honourable member for all the pressure, all the telephone calls he made. I have no doubt at all that one of the reasons that it was resolved was due to the very active work of the honourable member. But I'd also like to pay tribute to the consular staff in the embassy, because I also believe their telephone calls and the pressure they brought also helped to contribute to that being resolved. The second case that's raised is an even more difficult case, because it brings us into the Indian legal system. So in this particular case, which was the case of Mr. McCann, Gary McCann, crossing the road, found himself struck in a rickshaw by a bus in 2004. The consular staff at the moment, we're now going back 13 years through government records, it wasn't this government, it was a previous government that was then responding, identified a lawyer, tried to advise Mr. McCann to contact that lawyer. When Mr. McCann, the brother, visited, they were able to identify a witness who had seen the rickshaw struck, and they were able to introduce him to the witness. At the same time, Mr. McCann understandably feels real frustration, fury at the slowness at extracting promises from the Indian High Commission, getting hold of a death certificate, getting the prosecution done, and making sure that that lawyer from the Supreme Court brings the case fully forward. And we as the British government have to balance what we feel we ought to do with what we can do. And these are really difficult balancing acts. We have to respect the fact that India is not a British colony. It is an independent, proud state with a rapidly growing economy, its own legal system, that does not want to be told what to do by a former colonial power, with our belief in the rights and the justice which are due to our citizens and the kind of support we can provide for them to work within that legal system, which brings us to the Chennai Six. The Chennai Six, which I can see here two honourable members representing, is one of the most tragic cases that we have had to deal with. This is a case in which 6 British nationals on a ship that had arms on it because it was intended to provide support to actions against piracy on the Horn of Africa, docked in an Indian port. The Indian government, particularly Q branch, has argued and successfully won a prosecution in court on the basis that bringing arms into India in that way is illegal and the men have been detained. But at the very most, what these men are guilty of is being on a ship that docked in Indian waters. They have been cleared once. The case was then brought a second time. They were then prosecuted a second time. They've now brought an appeal, and it's taken nearly 9 months for that appeal to be heard. Meanwhile, they have spent nearly 4 years of their lives, and some of them very young people. I went personally to see John Armstrong in Chennai. I met with the Deputy Chief Minister's family, met with the consular staff, and met with all the men. These men are in a really tough situation. They're in a very unfamiliar context, and an Indian jail is a very challenging place to be. The consular staff have, yes, of course.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and I know how personally he has been involved in this, but does the Minister think that the Foreign Office and the consular staff in Chennai have done absolutely everything they possibly could to help the men currently in jail?
Minister.
I think the honest answer is that we can always do more for British citizens, but they have done a great deal. And I think they've done a great deal recently. They have provided a lot of support in terms of access for families to the jail. They've provided a lot of support for conditions in the jail. The High Commissioner has personally visited. The previous Minister has visited. The consular staff are putting an enormous amount of time and energy into this case. I personally have met with the lawyers who are representing the men. I've tried to give as much as I can, without being a lawyer myself, advice and support to the families and the men to make sure that they get the right legal advice. Fundamentally, though, the problem is a problem within the Indian legal system. And we have an obligation, I believe, as a government and as members of Parliament, to be honest with people, to be honest with people's expectations. One of the most tragic things that can happen in these situations is to raise expectations and to pretend that the Indian legal system is going to move faster than a really move. And I actually feel that from the men. I feel that they've been promised again and again a swift revolution that hasn't come, and I'm not sure that that has been the most honest or kind thing that we can do. I'm also very, very aware of the number of meetings that have been held. The Prime Minister, our own Prime Minister, raised this again with Prime Minister Modi at the latest meeting that they had. It's been raised by the Chancellor. It's been raised repeatedly by the Foreign Secretary. The fundamental problem, though, remains within the Indian legal system. We need to keep pressing. And unfortunately, it is a similar case with Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is an Iranian-British dual national who has been detained, like, unfortunately, many American-Iranian dual nationals and many other dual nationals in Iran by the Iranian government on very, very unclear grounds. Consular access has been refused. My right honourable friend, who's just paid a visit to Iran, raised this case directly with the Iranian government. And again, we're facing a struggle with how we exercise British power and influence in these very different contexts. We're hearing about southern Iraq, we're hearing about Iran, we're hearing about India. But in fact, our consular work is taking place in nearly 200 consulates around the world, every one of them with different specific local conditions. So if I can end, Mr. McCabe, by being constructive. What have we got to do to improve this situation? How can we do better for British citizens going forward? How do we face this new world where we've got 70 million people travelling? How do we face a new world with these kinds of dangers? 3 ideas. Number one, we need to focus much more on how we assess vulnerability. We're never going to be able to deal with every one of the 70 million trips that British nationals make worldwide, even with 700 consular staff. So we need to get much better at mixing compassion, intelligence, and some difficult prioritization to make sure that the people who are in the toughest situations actually receive that support. That involves understanding their context, understanding their family situation, understanding their financial situation, and understanding, above all, what we can actually do to help. Secondly, we need to try to work with British citizens to make sure that they themselves take responsibility, that they take precautions, that they get adequate travel insurance, that they follow British Embassy travel advice, that they do not engage in activities which are inherently risky. And that isn't just personal responsibility, that's also industry responsibility. How do we make sure that travel agencies, employers, and others fulfill their obligations to citizens? One of the questions raised by the honourable gentleman who brought this debate is, what is the obligation of the company? Again, with the Chennai 6, what on earth is the obligation of the company that employed these men, that has stopped paying them their salaries, have not paid their legal fees, and have made no attempt whatsoever to represent their own employees in court, leaving not just 6 British citizens, but 10 Estonians and a dozen Indians also in jail because the company has not represented them. And finally, I think we need to be clear about prevention. What can we do in advance to stop these situations happening? So, if there are problems in the prison systems in other people's countries, how can we work in advance with those countries to begin improving their prison systems? If there are problems in the legal systems in countries, are the things that we can do now to start working respectfully, diligently, persistently, courageously to drive change in their legal systems so that British citizens are not caught in these problems in the future? And the reason why this is important is we want British citizens to travel, to keep travelling, to travel as they never did before. We want to acknowledge the fact that those 70 million trips we make abroad are just the beginning. We want British citizens to educate themselves abroad. We want British citizens to trade abroad. We want British citizens to be able to enjoy themselves abroad. And the entire existence of our department fundamentally is predicated on trying to enable that spirit of an adventurous, trading, outward-facing nation whose citizens can feel the confidence where they go that the strong arm, the watchful eye of Great Britain is with them, but with them with realism, with them with pragmatism, with them with humility, because in this connection between the citizen and the state, in some of the most difficult, dangerous situations on earth, we have one of the most challenging foreign policy challenges of our era. And that's why I would like to pay tribute to Parliament, to the way that Parliament has today, and indeed for nearly 200 years, championed the interests of British citizens abroad, and also pay tribute to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and our consular staff, who, for all the frustrations and for all the bewilderment that so many constituents feel, feeling let down, feeling isolated, feeling afraid abroad, continue to try in very difficult circumstances to provide what support they can. Thank you very much, Mr. McKay.